Leo lived in a small, quiet village, nestled in a valley and surrounded by rolling green hills. These hills were soft and friendly, covered in wildflowers and grazing sheep. But beyond these gentle slopes, there was something much bigger and more mysterious: the Obsidian Peak. It was a massive, dark mountain made of ancient black stone, with a sharp, jagged top that seemed to pierce the clouds like a needle. Every morning, before the sun was fully up, Leo looked out of his bedroom window. While his neighbors looked at their vegetable gardens or the dusty road leading to the market, Leo's eyes were always fixed on the distant silhouette of the mountain. In the morning light, the peak looked purple. In the evening, it turned a deep, intimidating black. One day, he whispered to himself, his breath fogging the glass, "I will stand on top of that giant and see what the rest of the world looks like." Leo was not a professional athlete or a mountain guide. He was a simple young man who spent his days working at the local library, surrounded by the smell of old paper and ink. He spent his lunch breaks reading books about famous explorers, legendary climbs, and the secrets of the natural world. He knew the names of the highest peaks in the world, but reading was not enough anymore. He wanted his own story. He wanted to feel the bite of the cold wind on his skin and the hard, unforgiving reality of the rock under his fingertips. His friends at the village cafe often laughed when he mentioned his dream. "Leo, that mountain is a wall of shadows and danger," they warned him over their coffee. "It is full of falling rocks and sudden storms. Stay here in the village. It is safe, warm, and predictable." But Leo knew that a life without risk was a life without growth. He understood that a safe life was comfortable, but it was not always a happy or fulfilling one. He started to save every coin from his library salary. Slowly, he bought his gear: a pair of strong blue shorts designed for movement, a simple gray t-shirt that could dry quickly, and a bright, shiny orange helmet. He chose the orange color carefully. He wanted to be a small spark of light against the dark face of the mountain. Climbing a mountain like Obsidian Peak is not just about walking upward. It is a complex puzzle of physical strength and technical knowledge. Leo spent 6 long months preparing his body and his mind for the challenge. Every evening after the library closed, he went to a small gym in the next town. He didn't just lift weights. He focused on his grip strength, hanging from small wooden ledges to make his fingers as strong as steel hooks. He purchased a professional climbing harness, which felt heavy and serious in his hands. He also bought a dozen carabiners, those colorful metal loops that act as a climber's lifeline. He spent hours in his backyard practicing how to tie the figure-8 knot and the bowline knot. He wanted his hands to remember the movements, even if he was tired or scared. "Safety is not an accident, it is a habit," he remembered reading in one of his library books. He also spent many nights studying a detailed map of Obsidian Peak. He learned that the mountain was divided into 3 distinct zones: the green forest at the base, the windy pass in the middle, and finally the vertical wall near the summit. The vertical wall was the part that most climbers turned back. It was a sheer cliff of obsidian rock that went straight up for hundreds of meters, offering very few places to rest. Leo practiced with his gear until the clink of the metal and the texture of the rope felt like a part of his own body. He practiced climbing in the dark with a headlamp and in the cold to simulate the mountain's environment. Finally, he felt ready, or at least he felt as ready as a librarian could ever be to face a giant of stone. On a crisp, sunny Monday morning, Leo finally packed his heavy backpack. He carefully organized his supplies: 4 liters of water, bags of dried mango and nuts for energy, his coiled climbing rope, and his bright orange helmet. He checked his list 3 times before closing the bag. He walked through the quiet village streets as the shops were just beginning to open. His mother was waiting for him at the wooden gate of their garden. She looked at his heavy pack and his determined face. Her eyes were full of the typical worry of a mother, but there was also a spark of pride in her smile. "Be careful, Leo," she said, pulling him into a tight hug that smelled of cinnamon and home. "The mountain is big and ancient, but remember that your heart and your will are also very powerful." "I will be careful, Mom, I promise. And when I come back, I will bring you a special stone from the very top," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. He turned away and started walking toward the horizon. The air was cool and smelled of pine trees. At first, the journey was pleasant. The path was a wide trail through the tall grass, decorated with blue and yellow flowers. Birds were singing in the bushes, and the sun felt like a warm hand on his back. Leo felt like a hero in an epic poem. He felt alive, free, and completely focused on the path ahead. By noon, the sun was high in the sky, and Leo had reached the thick base of the mountain. The trees here were different from the ones near the village. They were ancient oaks and giant pines, with trunks so wide that 3 people could not hold hands around them. This was known as the Whispering Forest because the wind moving through the high branches created a sound like 1,000 people talking in hushed voices. The path began to change. It became steeper, and the smooth dirt was replaced by tangled tree roots and sharp stones. Leo's legs began to burn, and his breath became shorter. He stopped near a small stream to splash cold water on his face and take a long drink. "This is just the entrance fee," he told himself, wiped his forehead, and kept moving. Inside the forest, the world felt magical and a little bit frightening. He saw a small deer with wide, curious eyes watching him from a thicket of ferns. A bright red squirrel chattered at him before disappearing up a tree. Leo felt a strange sense of belonging. He was no longer the man who lived between the pages of books. He was a traveler in the real world. However, the beauty of the forest was also a distraction. The tall, thick canopy of leaves blocked most of the sunlight, making it difficult to see the trail in some places. The air was humid and smelled of damp earth and moss. Leo had to stay very focused. He knew that getting lost in the Whispering Forest would end his journey before it truly began. He followed the small piles of stones, called cairns, left by previous travelers to find his way through the shadows. When Leo finally emerged from the top of the forest, the transition was shocking. The world of green leaves and soft dirt vanished. In its place was a landscape of gray granite, low-growing shrubs, and sharp, broken rocks. This was the Windy Pass, a narrow ridge that connected the forest to the high cliffs. The wind here was a physical force. It didn't just blow, it pushed and pulled, screaming as it rushed through the gaps in the rocks. Leo had to lean his whole body forward just to stay balanced. The temperature dropped significantly, and he had to put on a jacket to stop his hands from shaking. "Wow," he tried to shout, but the wind snatched the sound from his lips and carried it away into the valley. The ground was treacherous. It was covered in scree, thousands of small, loose stones that moved under his feet like marbles. Every 2 steps forward felt like 1 step back. His boots were getting scratched, and his knees were tired from the constant balancing act. He looked up, and for a moment his heart sank. The Obsidian Peak looked terrifyingly close and impossibly high. It was like a silent, dark god looking down at a tiny, orange-capped insect. As the sun began to hide behind the neighboring peaks, Leo found a small, shallow cave. It was barely big enough for him to lie down, but it offered protection from the wind. He ate a simple meal of hard bread and salty cheese. As he lay in his sleeping bag, he watched the stars through the mouth of the cave. Without the lights of the village, the stars were incredibly bright and numerous. He felt tiny, but he also felt part of something vast and beautiful. The next morning, Leo woke up to a gray, muffled world. The bright blue sky was gone, replaced by heavy, dark clouds that touched the mountainside. Before he could even pack his bag, the first drops of rain began to fall. Within minutes, it was a steady, cold downpour. Leo knew from his books that climbing on wet obsidian was a recipe for disaster. This type of rock is naturally smooth, and when it is wet, it becomes as slippery as a sheet of ice. A single mistake would lead to a long fall. He had no choice. He had to stay in the cave and wait. He felt a wave of frustration. "I am so close. I want to move. I want to finish this," he shouted at the empty cave. But the mountain was unmoved by his anger. It was teaching him the most important lesson for any explorer: patience. You cannot force nature to follow your schedule. You must listen to the mountain and wait for the right moment. He spent the entire day sitting in the cave. To pass the time, he performed a gear check. He cleaned the dirt from his carabiners until they shone. He ran his fingers over every centimeter of his rope, looking for any sign of wear or damage. He realized that climbing was not just about the physical act of moving upward. It was 10% movement and 90% preparation, waiting, and mental discipline. By the time evening arrived, the rain slowed to a drizzle. The clouds finally broke apart, revealing a giant silver moon that turned the wet rocks into a landscape of shimmering metal. On the morning of the third day, as Leo was navigating a difficult section of the pass, he saw a figure sitting quietly on a flat rock. It was a man who looked like he belonged to the mountain. He was older, with a long gray beard and skin that looked like worn leather from years of sun and wind. Beside him was a backpack that looked much more professional and used than Leo's. "Hello there," Leo called out, his voice a bit raspy from the cold air. The man looked up and smiled, showing a few missing teeth. "Good morning, young man. Heading for the summit?" "Yes," Leo replied, sitting down for a moment to rest his legs. "It's my first time. It's a lot harder than the book said." "The mountain is the only book that matters," the man said with a quiet laugh. "But remember this, the summit is only the halfway point. Most people forget that. You still have to come back down with tired legs and a wandering mind. Respect the descent as much as the ascent." The old climber looked at Leo's orange helmet and gave him one final piece of wisdom. "When you reach the vertical wall, don't look at the top. If you look at the top, you will feel small and overwhelmed. Only look at the next 10 centimeters of rock. Find the next hold, move one hand, then move one foot. That is how you climb a giant, one tiny piece at a time." Leo thanked the man and felt a new sense of calm. He wasn't just a librarian on a walk anymore. He was a student of the mountain. Finally, after hours of hard hiking, Leo stood at the base of the vertical wall. It was even more impressive and terrifying in person than in his dreams. The black obsidian rose up like a dark skyscraper, smooth and shimmering. There were no paths here, only tiny cracks and small ledges. He took a deep breath and prepared himself. He put on his orange helmet and clicked the strap under his chin. He stepped into his harness, pulling the straps tight until they felt like a firm hug around his waist and legs. He organized the carabiners on his belt. They made a rhythmic metallic music. Clink, clink, clink. He took the end of his rope and tied a perfect figure-8 knot, checking it twice. His hands were shaking slightly, and he could feel his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. Thump, thump, thump. He reached out and placed his bare hands on the rock. It was shockingly cold and had a strange glass-like texture. He found a small horizontal crack for his right hand and a tiny protrusion for his left foot. He took a deep breath, cleared his mind of everything except the rock, and pulled his body upward. 1 meter, 2 meters, 5 meters. The world below his feet began to fall away. The wind tried to pull him from the wall, but he pressed his body close to the stone. He didn't look down at the forest or the village. He remembered the old man's words, and focused only on the small patch of black rock right in front of his eyes. The climb was physically and mentally exhausting. Every muscle in Leo's body was under extreme tension. His forearms felt like they were on fire, and his fingertips were beginning to bleed slightly from the sharp edges of the obsidian. He reached a section where the rock was almost completely smooth, with no obvious holds. He felt a moment of pure panic. His legs began to shake, a phenomenon climbers call sewing machine leg. Then it happened. His left foot, placed on a tiny edge, slipped. Ah, he gasped as he fell. The world blurred for a second, but then his rope went tight. His harness jerked, and his carabiners held firm. He swung against the rock face, dangling over a drop of 300 meters. He was breathing heavily, his eyes wide. But he was alive. His gear had worked perfectly. He looked at his orange helmet. It had a new, deep scratch from where it hit the rock, but it had saved his head from a nasty bump. He hung there for several minutes, suspended between the valley floor and the sky. He forced himself to look out at the horizon. He could see the entire valley, the river like a silver thread, and his village like a collection of tiny pebbles. He realized how far he had come. He wasn't the librarian anymore. He was the man who survived a fall on Obsidian Peak. "I can do this," he whispered, his voice cracking. "I am strong enough." He swung back to the wall, found his footing, and began to climb again. He moved with more caution now, testing every hold before committing his weight. He moved like a slow, orange-capped spider, determined to reach the light. As Leo climbed higher, the environment changed again. The air became thin and cold, making every breath feel like a struggle. But the reward was beyond words. He was now higher than the clouds that had blocked his path the day before. They looked like a vast, silent ocean of white foam, with only the highest peaks sticking out like islands. The sun was beginning its descent, painting the entire world in impossible colors. The white clouds turned pink, the sky became a deep violet, and the edges of the obsidian rock glowed with a golden light. It was a symphony of color that no camera could truly capture, and no library book could fully describe. He felt a strange sense of isolation, but it wasn't a lonely feeling. It was a feeling of being exactly where he was meant to be. He was the only human being in this high, cold world of light and stone. The top was finally in sight, a flat, rocky platform just a few meters above him. He reached up, found a solid ledge, and with one final, screaming effort from his tired muscles, he pulled his chest over the edge and crawled onto the flat ground. He had made it. Instead, he simply rolled onto his back and looked up at the darkening sky. He stayed like that for a long time, listening to the sound of his own heavy breathing and the fast beat of his heart. Tears of exhaustion and pure joy leaked from his eyes and ran down his dusty cheeks. After a few minutes, he sat up. The view was 360 degrees of pure wonder. He could see for hundreds of kilometers in every direction. He saw mountain ranges he never knew existed and the faint shimmer of the sea on the distant horizon. He took out his small camera and took a few photos, but he knew the real picture was burned into his memory forever. He remembered his promise to his mother. He looked around the summit and found a small, perfectly smooth piece of obsidian. It was black and shiny, shaped like a teardrop. He tucked it safely into his pocket. The silence at the top was profound. There was no wind here now, just a deep, heavy quiet. He felt a profound connection to the mountain. It wasn't a monster to be defeated or a giant to be killed. It was a part of the earth that had allowed him to visit. He realized that the top wasn't just a destination on a map. It was a state of mind. He had proven to himself that he could do something difficult, something scary, and something beautiful. The descent was long and required every bit of Leo's remaining concentration. As the old man had warned, his legs were like jelly, and his mind wanted to wander. He had to double-check every knot and every carabiner. He moved slowly and carefully, respecting the mountain until the very last meter. He spent one more night in his small cave, sleeping more deeply than he ever had in his life. The next day, he moved back through the windy pass and into the familiar shadows of the whispering forest. The trees felt like old friends welcoming him back to the world of the living. It was late Tuesday night when he finally walked down the main street of his village. The shops were closed and the streets were empty. He arrived at his gate, his body aching, his clothes covered in gray dust and dried sweat. His orange helmet was scratched and dull. His mother was sitting on the porch, wrapped in a blanket. She stood up the moment she saw the orange glow of his helmet in the moonlight. She didn't say anything. She just ran to him and held him. He reached into his pocket and placed the smooth, black teardrop of obsidian into her hand. "I made it, Mom," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I know," she smiled, her eyes wet with tears. "I sat here every evening, and I could see your little orange helmet moving against the dark rock. You were the brightest thing on the mountain." Leo went to bed that night and slept for a day and a night. He didn't dream of mountains or adventures. He didn't need to. He had stepped out of the books and into the world. He was still a librarian, but now he was a librarian who knew what it felt like to touch the sky. He was the man who went to the top, and he knew that every mountain in his life, no matter how high, could be climbed 10 centimeters at a time. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe, like, and leave a comment. It really helps the channel. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.